Hi, we are in the Tiergarten in the center of Berlin, and we are going to do a review of the Nikon D7200, which is this camera. Now, we've been using the Nikon D7200 for the past week here in Berlin, shot thousands and thousands of images here, and we're going to do a comparison between this camera and our own D7100, which we have been using for the past 2 years. We're going to talk about some of the differences that Nikon implemented, some of the major differences, and some of the more subtle differences that Nikon maybe didn't mention when it announced this camera, but we actually found when we used it. So we're going to look at the differences, we are going to look at performance, and finally we are going to have a look at what we think in general about this camera, both on its own and compared to the Nikon D7100. So let's start. So we want to go over some of the specifications of both cameras and the differences between them. So this is the D7200 and this is the D7100. We're going to do this very briefly because you can basically find this anywhere. So in terms of the sensor on the D7200, we have a 24.2 megapixel sensor, while on the D7100 you have a 24.1 megapixel sensor. The only reason why this should matter to you in any way is because this means that for all intents and purposes, the sensor on the D7200 is probably a different sensor, maybe an improved version of the Toshiba sensor that we have on the D7100. And we will talk about the image quality later on in this review. So this is one difference. The second difference is in the processor, and the processor on the D7200 is the Xpeed 4, while on the D7100 we have the Xpeed 3. It's supposed to be about 30% faster and obviously perform better in low light situations in terms of the ISO, as well as allow for a better video and maybe a few other things. So this is in terms of the processor. Now, talking about the sensitivity, it has a sensitivity, the D7200 has a sensitivity which goes up to 25,600 natively, and you can expand it by 2 stops further. This is better than the sensitivity, the native sensitivity of the D7100, which only go to 6,400. So this is an interesting difference. We will see again the actual performance later on in this review. Now, in terms of the autofocus on the D7200, they have the same autofocus system, but apparently Nikon has improved some of the aspects of it in the D7200. So we have here a sensor which is sensitive up to -3 EVs, while the sensor or the performance of the D7100 is only good up to 2 EV. So this is the difference between them, and we will see this as well later on in this review. Now, another big change between the D7200 and the D7100 is the buffer. On the D7200 we have up to 18 images in 14 bits versus just 6 on the D7100, or 27 in 12 bits and much lower number on the D7100. We will see the actual number later on. So this is another difference. On the D7100 you only have Wi-Fi using an external adapter, while here you have both Wi-Fi and NFC built into the camera. So this is nice. On the D7200 you also have a video capability up to 1080p at 60p, while here you have 1080p at 30p or 60i. So another difference. Also in terms of video, you have picture control 2, which allows the D7200 to have a flat picture, which is good for video if you want to edit it later on. And the battery life, this is the final thing, should be better. It's rated officially at 1110 on the D7200 versus only 950 on the D7100. So these are all the official differences, the main official differences between the two cameras. We will later on see how much of a difference we have in terms of the menus and other things that Nikon implemented in the D7200. So we want to take a look at the D7200 on this side versus the D7100 in terms of the general design. Now, as you can see, basically they're exactly the same. In the front, all the things that you have, all the components, the dial in here, the same as you see in here, the lens release, the two buttons on this side, and the autofocus and manual focus switches exactly at the same place. The only visible difference, of course, is the name of the camera, D7100 and D7200. So in this respect, exactly the same. The top of the cameras, again, exactly similar. And the back of the cameras is also exactly similar. As you can see, from some reason we lost the the rubber that we have, the eye cap around the viewfinder. We are not sure exactly what happened, but for some reason this camera lost it twice. One before us, and we also lost it in Germany. Maybe something on this particular camera was not strong enough in this part, but it shouldn't be any difference from the D7100, and we never lost the eye cap on the D7100. So again, as you can see, exactly the same layout of buttons and switches and dials in this case as you have on the D7100. Now, the only real difference externally is if you look at the side. As you can see on the D7200, you have the Wi-Fi logo, and on the other side you have here the NFC logo. So these are really the only external differences that you can see visibly from the D7100. You have two SD cards just like on the D7100. So basically they're just identical externally. Now, the more interesting thing to look at, obviously, is how much they actually differ in terms of the menus. And this is what we are going to look at now. So before we go into the menus, I want to show you something on the top screen of the D7200, which is on this side. As you can see, all the letters and numbers on this side are fairly large. And if you compare this to the D7100, which is on this side, you will be able to compare and see that the numbers are really much larger and easier to read. Now, another important thing, this turns off rather quickly, is this exposure meter that we have on the D7200 and we didn't have on the D7100. And for us at least, this is one of the biggest important changes between the two cameras. This might sound strange, but if you've been using this camera, the D7100, for as long as we have been using it, for almost 2 years now, you will understand how important this meter really is. So this is a huge difference, and there are some other differences in the layout of the numbers that we have here. So now let's go and look at some menus. So for example, if we look at the autofocus sub-menu here, we can see that we have things that we don't have on the D7100. So for example, store points by orientation. You can turn this on and off. And you have autofocus activation, which is another thing that you don't have on this sub-menu, like a shutter and AF on only. So this is one change, and we found that there are quite a few others changes that Nikon implemented in this sub-menu. Of course, you have things like Wi-Fi and NFC, which doesn't exist at all built in on this camera. So if you want to change them, NFC doesn't exist, but if you want to change the Wi-Fi here, it's called wireless mobile adapter, and it's basically enable and disable. And here we have all sorts of settings that you have. So basically there are a few changes that Nikon implemented and a few things that are different. Another interesting change is that, for example, if we press anything on the D7100, nothing happens. Here, if we press, we always get this information display, which is nice. It's a useful feature, and we can, by pressing any one of these buttons, basically change anything with the use of the forward and backwards dials. So this is a nice touch. And again, Nikon implemented all these small incremental changes in the D7200, which are really useful, and Nikon didn't really talk about them too much. They talked about all the major changes, sensor, maybe the processor, the buffer, but these small changes are actually not less important for actually practically using this in the field. So from here on, let's talk about the actual performance of the D7200 when compared to the D7100. So now we are going to do a very quick autofocus test of both cameras. We are going to shoot this figurine on our countertop, and we're going to test both the D7100 and D7200 using both phase detect and contrast-based autofocus. So let's start, and we're going to start with the Nikon D7100 using the Nikon 105mm f2.8 lens, which you can see currently on the camera, and we're going to start with the phase detect autofocus. First, we need to make sure that the lens is completely out of focus. Like this, and let's see how quickly does it focus in this state. Fairly quickly, as you can see. Now let's test the contrast-based autofocus of the D7100. Also fairly quickly. Now let's see how the D7200 functions in terms of autofocus in low light situations. This is exactly the same settings as before. Phase detect, autofocus. Let's see how it functions. Very fast. Now for the contrast-based autofocus test. Also fairly fast. So this was a comparison between the two. I think that the difference is not huge, as you can see, but now let's see how both cameras functions in terms of the buffer. Buffer size is going to be one of the biggest differences between this camera, the D7100, and the D7200. Now we are going to test both cameras in different settings. So we're going to start with 14-bit RAW plus JPEG. We're testing both cameras with JPEG at optimal quality, lossless compression, vignetting, noise reduction, and autofocus all turned off. And as you can see, we're using very fast shutter speed. We're also using the fastest SD card from SanDisk, which we have tested here a few years back. So just to make sure that we're not limited by any other factors. So let's see what the D7100 can do. We're using the 105mm macro lens from Nikon again. So as you can see, this was very, very short burst. We only got 5 images at this settings from the D7100. Let's see what the D7200 can do in these settings. So let's see how the D7200 performs in terms of the buffer. Exactly the same settings, 14-bit RAW plus JPEG, the most extreme settings that you can set this camera to. Half press, you can see what the camera states as the buffer, not necessarily the actual buffer. So let's test how fast or how big the buffer really is. We got 13 images. So this is about almost 3 times as big as we got on the D7100. Now we also tested 12-bit RAW plus JPEG, and we got 18 images on the D7200 versus only 6 on the D7100. We also tested 14-bit RAW without JPEG. We got 22 images on the D7200 versus only 6 again on the D7100. Now we also tested 12-bit RAW, and we got 39 images, while only 7 on the D7100, which is a very low number. And finally, for some reason, we only got 8 images in the buffer when we shot JPEG with the D7100, while we got 100 on the D7200. So this is a very, very substantial difference for anybody who is interested in shooting a lot of consecutive images. Here is our quick sensitivity test. Both cameras were set on a tripod with a timer with the same Nikon 50mm f1.8 manual focus lens. We started with a basic ISO set to 100. As you can see on the right, this is the image from the D7200. And if you compare it on the left to the D7100 image, you can see that you have a lot more details here on the right. And also the color, the saturation of the color seems to be a lot more significant. You can see this on this figurine here on the right. You have a lot more details, but a lot more vibrance, if you like, on the D7200. So this is basically ISO 100, and even in this level you see slight difference. Here it's very easy to see noise. You don't have a lot of noise in ISO 100, but still this will be a very good place to look for noise in higher ISO. So let's move to something a bit higher. So this is ISO 800 on both cameras. Let's compare it. We're using Fastone to do this comparison. So let's look. Again, you see a lot more details. Look at the blacks. Look at this blue thread here versus what you have here. Again, a lot more details. And here you're starting to see a bit of noise on the D7100. The D7200 looks pretty clean on this image. This is ISO 800, as we said. And this is the figurine. You can see slight noise around the figurine. Here you don't see, I think, any noise or almost any noise. So let's move to ISO 1600. This is the comparison between the two cameras at ISO 1600. Here you go. So again, still a lot of details in this level. Here you can see a lot of noise on the D7100. You see some noise on the D7200, but if we go to the figurine here on the right, you can see the difference. It's very clear. And again, you still see more vivid colors and probably more details as well. So I would say that 1600 is probably the highest that we would go if we want a decent image on the D7100. On both cameras this looks okay. If we go beyond that on the D7100, as we will see in a second, this is 3200 on both cameras. You can see that the image on the D7100 is not really that acceptable anymore. So if we go down here, you can see how much noise we are getting at ISO 3200 versus the Nikon D7200 at the same ISO. You do get some noise, of course. It's a pretty high ISO for an APS-C camera, but it's still, I would say that it's still more or less acceptable on the D7200. On the 100 on the left, it's pushing it. We would normally not use this image anymore. So this is a 3200. If we go beyond that, both cameras, in our opinion at least, are not really usable. So let's see the results. Here you go, and as you can see, you have a lot of noise at this very high ISO on both cameras. Again, the D7100 is practically completely unusable, at least in our opinion. The D7200, well, you see a lot of loss of details, as you can see in here. Again, on the left, it's completely unusable. If you look at the figurine again, you see a lot of noise in the background, but the image still has some details. I'm not sure if this is usable, maybe barely. If you're using it for the web, you can use it, but for print, I'm not sure. So this is more or less what you're getting in terms of the difference. I would say that you're looking at about one stop of difference between the two cameras, maybe a bit more, I'm not sure. But this is more or less what you're getting. A lot more details, which is interesting, some more vibrance, and about a stop of difference in terms of the sensitivity. From here on, let's look at the conclusion and what we think in general about both cameras and specifically about the D7200. So we want to conclude this review of the Nikon D7200. Now, we think that this camera is an interesting improvement over the D7100. On the one hand, there aren't any big major changes from the D7100, but on the other hand, there are some very welcome smaller incremental changes from the previous generation. Now, in terms of image quality, we have shown you how much better the image quality on the D7200 is when compared to the D7100. We have shown you the increased buffer. We've talked about, in general, in terms of the autofocus, especially when using this camera in low light situations. But what we think is more interesting, actually, is not all these well-known changes, it's actually the smaller changes. We really like the changes that Nikon has made in the top screen, especially the inclusion of the metering, the light meter, which gives you the ability to change the exposure and see what you actually have in terms of exposure on the top screen, which we didn't have on the D7100, which was a very big miss in terms of the actual usage of the camera. We also like the changes that Nikon implemented in the menus. The video menu is very useful, and there are a few other menus that are either been improved or completely new. So these changes are also welcome. The battery improvement, we didn't have the camera for a long enough time to actually measure how much the improvement of the battery. It's the same battery, but it just the processor is better and more tuned, if you like. So we can't really tell how much of an improvement it is, but it should give you at least 100 or 200 more images per battery. Again, the same battery, just better performance. So this is when compared to the D7100. But on its own, if you don't have a camera or have a previous model, a lower end model, or maybe a completely different camera, or you just want to dive into a medium range camera as your first camera, we think that this is possibly the best all-around camera on the APS-C sector. Now, you can go for something like the 7D Mark II if you're looking for more sports photography or birds photography or wildlife maybe, and you need a faster frame rate than what the Nikon D7200 offers. But in general, in terms of the image quality and the all-around characteristics of this camera, we think that the D7200 is currently the best all-around that you can buy presently. Now, Nikon is going to come up, hopefully, with a replacement for the D300S, which will compete with the 7D Mark II. So we hope that Nikon will have something to compete against Canon. But if you don't really need this faster frame rate and larger body, then again, the D7200 is a great option. Make sure you subscribe to our channel on YouTube, and if you want to read the full review of the D7200, go to LensVid.com.